Hey guys, welcome to our pretty sunny. So I guess a lot of people have been wanting to be outside. My name is Stacey Huang. I'm one of the physios at the downtown location for Cleveland Clinic Canada. And what we're going to be talking about is basically a simplified version of like what we're looking for running biomechanics. Like obviously you can kind of like really dive into this and it becomes a little overcomplicated. So we're going to try to kind of present some really simple things that we want to work on and why we're doing them, the rationale behind them. So really, what's the importance of a good running mechanics? Probably for most of you, you're looking to prevent injury. Oh, sorry, I meant to say at the end of this, we'll also take some questions. So if you want to put some questions in the chat, we'll be checking that as well. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to want to prevent injuries. So basically we want to unload your joints as much as we can and make sure that you're actually getting like a muscular firing through your lower extremity when you're running. So we want to avoid like IT band syndrome, straining your hamstrings, like plantar fasciitis, all those common things that you guys will be talking about next week with Beth. So that's one reason we want to look at your running mechanics. The other reason is that we want to make really your runs are going to feel a lot easier. And then what's going to happen is you're going to get a little bit faster. So you're going to really enjoy your runs a lot more because they won't feel like you're kind of slogging through them, and that you'll actually gain a little bit more speed as you keep going along if you're working on your biomechanics. So we're going to focus on basically two very simple parts of your stride when we're talking about changing the way that you run. The first thing is we're going to talk about changing your heel strike, and the second thing is going to be your toe off. So what we mean by a heel strike, and it's going to be a general compass statement for that, is when you first make contact with the ground. So when you first put your foot down on the ground, that's what we're going to classify as your heel strike. And then what we're going to classify as your toe off is when you actually push off the ground. So like for most of you who've been running for a while, that's basically what we're going to call like your kick, right? So we're going to talk about the heel strike first. But like if you guys have ever watched the Flintstones back in the day, hopefully most of you have, depending on the age group of people here. So if you want to think about it, what is Fred's his car? He's probably, you'll see the image of him, right? So if you can imagine putting your heels down, that's how we put on the brakes when we're running. So Fred has his legs out in front of him, he puts his heels down, and then that's going to be a really hard brake. So I actually don't fully enjoy the sentence or like the statement of a heel strike. So we don't want to actually heel strike when we first land our foot in front of us. And the reason for that is just basic physics. And I'm a little bit of a physics nerd, so you're gonna have to bear with me for a second while we kind of talk about this. But basically what happens with a heel strike is we land our heel right in front of us. You'll see that little arrow there. That's the ground reaction force that you get. So basically if we land our heel in front of us, what we're going to get is we're going to get a push backwards and up. And then that's going to apply some pressure into our joints. But the other thing is that it pushes us backwards. So the directionality of that arrow is that it goes up and it goes backwards. And that's something we want to avoid because essentially you're not going to, that's not going to help you propel yourself forward. You're actually pushing yourself a little bit backwards every time you heel strike. So what we want is we want to actually land a little bit more midfoot when we're talking about our heel strike. So we don't want to land on our toes either because you don't want to do like that prancing motion onto your toes because A, that's a lot of pressure on your toes, and then you're going to end up loading like the underneath of your foot a lot more if you're always springboarding off of them. So you're going to end up with things like a plantar fasciitis if you're trying to do that springboard move. So ideally, you actually want to contact like your midfoot when you kind of push off. So if you guys went back to, I think it was 2 weeks ago when Dan was talking about the warm-up. So one good example of like where you want your foot to land underneath you is he talks about those high knees and getting his knee up, and then he drops his foot underneath him. So you can see that like that's what you want. You want to be able to drive your knee up when you do, when you swing your leg up and you're trying to propel off your leg. But then when it comes back down, you want the foot to land underneath you. So I think there's a couple of videos up about that. So if you want to take a little look at like Dan's warm-up video, you can see what I mean by like that knee up and then landing the foot underneath you. But that's basically what we want to do, because it's going to feel like a little bit more work if we do it that way. So if you do your heel strike and your foot is underneath you, it's going to feel like more muscular work. And that's what it is. You have to actually use your muscles a lot more to land that way. A lot of people like a heel strike because it just feels a little less effortful, but at the end of the day, because you're not putting that effort in with your muscles, what's going to happen is your joints are going to pay for that. Because if you're not actually absorbing all that force through your muscles, what you are going to do is you're going to compact your joints. So in your ankles, in your knees, and your hips. So eventually that's going to start becoming a problem for you if you land too hard on your heels. So basically what we want to do, and this is a little bit of a complicated like image, but all you really need to know is like this negative portion is when you first strike your heel into the ground, and this force is basically forwards and backwards. So like this negative portion is the backwards portion, and then this positive portion is when you push off and you get an acceleration of like pushing forward. So at the end of the day, we want to do two things with our stride. We want to make this heel strike as small as possible. So we want to not lose force whenever we heel strike. So we're trying to minimize this heel strike, and we're trying to optimize this push off impulse. So then the math is just you spend a lot more force going forward as opposed to trying to absorb the heel strike, because the heel strike is always going to be negative. To be honest, you're always going to be pushing backward unless like for some weird reason you can land with your leg behind you, but then there's some complications with that. So the heel strike you want to make as small as possible, and then you want to do as much as you can to increase that toe off and that push forward. So your toe off, what you want to be doing is you're going to be with your back foot here pushing back onto the ground, and then the ground actually pushes you back. So then this arrow is actually going to be still upward, right? So we're always going to take some impact through our bodies when we walk and we run. That's pretty unavoidable. But the part that we're talking about here that we want to optimize is if this force is going upwards and then towards our hip and then going forward, we do have a portion that returns to us and it goes forward. So that's going to be like our forward momentum, right? So this is the size of the force that we're getting if we actually if we push off the ground. So how do we make that force a little bit more optimal is we want to increase your stride in the back. So let's say this is where we push off the ground, and that's the force that we apply to it. So if we apply the same force, but say we set it back like maybe 4 inches back, so if your stride becomes a little bit longer. So this force vector is the same as this one. So you're applying the same amount of force here. But you'll notice that because of where the foot is now placed and where the hip is, that angle becomes a little bit more. So we're taking advantage of like the lever to push back. And then what's gonna happen is this forward pressure that we're gonna get back becomes that forward pressure. So you can see with the same amount of effort put into the ground, so like muscular force, we're gonna actually end up with a force that's much bigger. So it's gonna propel you forward a lot more. So then you can actually power off. And some things that you might want to consider about like increasing your stride length is that's going to be a little bit different for everyone. So not everyone is going to be able to like get a very big kick in the back. So it depends on like how flexible your hips are, because unfortunately, if your hip is not super flexible, that swing of your hip actually becomes a little bit less, and then people tend to focus on that push, but then what they'll do is they'll arch their backs instead of actually swing their leg back. So you have to keep an eye on that. And also there's just how long is your leg, right? So there's only so much movement that you can get with the length of your leg. So those are kind of things to keep in mind. Everybody's a little bit different. So it's going to depend on your flexibility. It's going to depend on your leg length. And unfortunately, when we get to leg length, there's not too much you can do about that other than actually changing your cadence or how many times like you actually turn your legs over. But that's a different talk for a different day. But basically, what we're talking about for a stride length is that we want to minimize how much you're braking and we want to maximize how much you're pushing. So then hopefully you can kind of get on the road like Fred Flintstone does. So one of the big things I want to point out is that the summary for it is you want to shorten your stride in the front and you want to lengthen it in the back. So I like to say that I don't love the statement of like, put one foot in front of the other, because again, if you're putting one foot in front of the other and that's the thing that you're kind of concentrating on your run, you're going to be braking most of the time. So I want you to think about like trying to focus on kicking one foot after the other, right? It's going to naturally land underneath you. I want you to try not to reach with your foot when you're trying to run, because all you're going to do if you're reaching forward with your leg is that you're going to be applying the brakes a lot. And that's basically like all the math that we're going to do about your stride and what we want to get out of it. The other part is we just want to give you a couple little cues. So if you're thinking about your stride, you're thinking about the math of the force that you're putting. It's about like strengthening to try to make sure that you have the muscular strength to be able to push off a little bit better and to be able to reduce your heel strike and that you get a little bit better mobility in your hips. That's something that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but you can start thinking about these things and trying not to waste energy by putting your heel into the ground. But there's some other like little cues that are kind of external to you that you can apply. So that we can try to start wasting a little less energy. One big thing is I like to ask people to kind of like focus on where your eyes are when you run. So if you look at the horizon or whatever is kind of like flat in front of you, if you take a little look at that, is that horizon bouncing up and down for you? And if that horizon is going up and down, what that tells you is that you're probably jumping up and down. So when we talk about running, if you're spending a lot of energy like springboarding up and down, you're wasting a lot of your effort in going up and down, which is not going to propel you forward. It will feel like more work. And then the other side of it is that you're going to have to land it. So it's going to end up being a lot more impact. So that's something to keep in mind. But I find that one good thing is just to focus on the horizon. It's not going to go away that up and down because it's pretty impossible to analyze it. Then that means you're going to be actually moving your hips and moving your knees and moving your ankles a little bit more fluidly, and that you're not kind of landing and jolting on your joints. So one good thing is just to kind of focus your eyes on the horizon, try to make it as still as you can. The next thing you want to think about a little bit is a slight lean in the direction that you're moving. So for most people, I say that in the direction that you're moving, because if you're training a little bit, some people want to do a little bit of like backwards or lateral movement to kind of add into their running. So that's just a little bit of language just to be like, if you are training something that's like sideways or backwards, you are going to want to lean into the direction that you're moving. And the reason you want to do that is you're going to get your center of mass over your feet. So when you're running, you want to make sure that you're leaning slightly forward. You're not all the way flexed. So the advice that we often give people is just like, imagine that you're kind of running in a really strong wind and it's just right at your head, and you're going to lean your head slightly into that wind. And that's going to give you that little bit of a forward lean. And the next thing that we want to talk about, you go downhill. So I feel like this is a mistake that most people make, is that when they start going downhill, they're going to start leaning backwards. But again, you are actually going downhill. So you do want your lean to be slightly downhill. Again, it's going to keep like your center of mass underneath in between your feet, because you are actually falling forward. And I think most of you have actually heard this saying where like running is like gracefully falling. And that's what you want to think about when you're going downhill. You want to maintain control for sure. You don't want to just like actually kind of tumble your feet down the hill, but you can maintain control with things like shortening your strides. So making your strides a little bit smaller, and then making sure that you move your feet a little bit quicker so you have a little bit more contact time with the ground if you're having a hard time controlling your downhill descent. But again, you do want to be leaning forward, because like this woman here, you can see she's kind of doing two things we don't really want. She has her foot very far in front of her. She's got a lot of heel strike that's going to happen when she strikes that foot into the ground. And look how far her body is from actually the center of her feet. So it's going to be more likely to, so if you guys are doing trail running or anything like that, or that you're leaning a little bit forward when you're going downhill, and that you're absorbing the pressure a little bit from going downhill. So basically the big summary is things you want to look at in terms of like running biomechanics is you really want to reduce the amount that you're heel striking. So you want to reduce the amount that you're hitting the brakes. You're going to want to increase that stride length in the back. So shorter step forward, longer push off. What I like to call it, and if you can remember it that way, it's like the mullet form of running. So you want to like be short in the front, long in the back. So if you want to imagine that, and that's a little memory for you guys to remember what you're trying to do. And then you want to reduce your bounce during your push off, so you're not wasting that energy going upwards, because that doesn't get you anywhere. It's not going to make you any faster by actually doing that up and down movement. And then again, you're gonna wanna lean slightly forward. So these are 4 like simple things that you guys can focus on. But I wanna say changing your gait is really difficult. So I wouldn't try to do this entire list if I were you. I would actually take a little look at it. I do hit my heels super hard. It is really loud when I land my heels every time I run. Maybe that's what you want to start with. You might want to start by reducing how much you strike your heel and focus on where you land your foot whenever you're running. So pick one thing, because it's really hard to change all of these things at once. And if you're finding that it's really hard to do, of knowing which one of these things you're actually doing the most, check in with somebody. There's like running coaches you can check in with, obviously your physio, a lot of chiros will also be able to give you this advice, but an exercise physiologist, because they're also trained in biomechanics. So if you're having a difficulty figuring out which one of these parts of your gait is actually your downfall, it might be wise to just check in with somebody, have somebody check out your gait, and then have them give you a little advice on like what thing to work on. And I think, so this is your homework for this week. I think you guys have been introduced into hills last week, but just to remind you guys that the 10K group that you guys are going to be doing the steady state run and 3 times for 400-meter hills. One big thing is try not to 2.5 kilometer steady state run, because we are going to do it at a higher intensity, your runs uphill. So you want to reduce down your distance at this point. So don't try to add it in more because you think you should be pushing yourself more that day. The reduced distance is actually important. And then what you're going to do for your hills is you're going to go at a pretty high intensity for your 400 meters. So we're looking at like a 90% VO2 max if you're trying to do that run. And then what you're going to do is either you can take a little walk back down the hill, or you can do like a very slow jog back down the hill, maybe thinking about not putting your foot out in front of you, falling forward. So that same advice about how to handle your hills when you're going a little bit slower. All right. And then, oh, sorry, we'll have to go back. The other one was the tempo one for the 10K people. So the tempo run actually just means that you guys are going to go at probably around like an 80% if you guys have already been tested for that and you're doing a heart rate. Somewhere between like 80 to 94. 94 is pretty high. But that's basically the zone that you're going to work in. And if you don't know what that is, it's hard intensity. So you're not going to be able to have a conversation during that run. And then, but you can still get some words out. You can have a very short conversation if you're taking that run. So if you're thinking about how much effort that is. And also it is a 6-kilometer tempo run. So that might feel a little long for you guys. So if you guys are familiar, you don't have to do the entire thing as a tempo run. What you can do instead is you can also choose to add like a little fartlek in there. So if you don't know what a fartlek is, you'll just do like a steady pace like run. And then what you'll do is you'll add in a little bit of speed work. And the good thing about fartleks is they can be actually a little unstructured. So you can just choose something. So you're like, okay, so like from here to that pole, I'm gonna like increase my speed. So you're just playing around with your speed and trying to introduce a little bit of trying to push your anaerobic threshold a little bit. So that's all you need to do for that. So I guess we will take a little look at whether anybody has any questions. Oh, sorry, I keep clicking my screen, but I'm just gonna take a little look at the chat function and see if anybody said anything here.
What is causing piriformis issues after running?
So likely what that is like if you're having piriformis issues, I want to say mostly when it comes to a tight piriformis, it can be one of two things, is that piriformis is a little overworked, or it is just generally just a little bit weak and it's tight. So it can be tight for a couple of different reasons. It's just that you put too much pressure on it. So like I said, if we keep putting compression on your hip, your piriformis is going to have to do a lot more, because it's more of a stabilizer muscle. So if you're not super stable and strong on that hip and then you keep applying pressure to it, it's going to give you pain and tightness in your piriformis. But it can be because it's either weak or that it's overworked. It can be both if it's tight. So you have to kind of take a little look at which one of those things are true. I want to say more often than not, piriformis is probably more overworked. And it's probably because your glute med is a little bit weak. So it's taking on the work of your glute med, but you'd have to test it to know which way it goes. But I want to say generally your piriformis actually has to take on a lot of load.
Any tips on maintaining ankle stability through a longer run?
Yeah, so the funny thing is your leg is actually an entire system, right? So I think a lot of people will say like, my ankles don't feel really steady or they feel really weak when they're running, but it's an entire system. And I wanna say hips and ankles are a big kind of weak point for people. And weirdly enough, they'll also say they have knee pain because of one or both of those things. So I say there's a couple of things, and we're actually gonna talk about that in a couple of weeks about like strengthening your hips and strengthening your ankles. So one thing is actually to make sure you have enough ankle mobility is one thing you want to take a little look at, because sometimes if you don't actually have good movement in that ankle, it's hard to actually stabilize. But the other thing you can do is like those things that are commonly done, like doing supinations and pronations for your ankles. So scooping them in and scooping them out against resistance with like TheraBands. So that's one good place to start. Or if you actually just find that it's the balance itself that's a little challenging, then you can add exercises like on unstable surfaces or single legs balance exercises. So that's directly for the ankle. But I would also hip falls out, because if your hip is a little bit weak, then you're going to put a little bit more strain on your ankles, and then they're going to flare out a little bit as well.
Is there a video that you can refer to for an ideal gait?
I can find one, and then I can post that, and because I think Dan posted his videos post, or did he post them?
Yep.
So
They were posted, yeah.
Yeah, and we can do that.
And then what would you recommend to eliminate lower back pain when running?
Yeah, so that's the thing. So one of the things is reducing that heel strength, because obviously your body is not like one segment on its own. So basically everything is connected. So that heel strike that happens from your heel hitting the ground, that is going to radiate up into your back. So one thing is trying to take the compression out of your run. So all those hard hitting things, all the impact that you're gonna get during your run, if you can reduce that down, that's gonna help. And same thing, if you strengthen up all the joints that kind of lead up to it. So if you're strengthening your ankles, you're strengthening your knees, you're strengthening your hips, that's gonna help take the load off your back as well. And the other thing is actually that stance that we do. We talked about like leaning forward a little bit, because I find that a lot of runners, I don't know why, but it's a little bit of an aesthetic thing. People want to be very rigidly upright when they run, and they're trying to be very straight up. But what that leads them to do is curve their backs in order to stay very upright. So I would actually recommend that lean forward, because you're probably straining your back a little bit if you find yourself leaning backwards a little when you run. So reducing the impact, strengthening up your glutes, your hips, your hamstrings, so that you can push off a little bit better. So if you're stronger with that push off through your legs, again, we talked about like hip extension. And if you can't do hip extension, what you are gonna do is you're gonna do back extension. So then you're gonna start leaning into your back to try to get that push off. So it might be your balance, it might be whether you're actually leaning backwards and you're straining your back, or it might be that your kick is not super strong, so then you start arching into your back to try to get a bigger kick.
All right, and our last question. So the heel should touch the ground first, but lightly as possible, and then shift weight to midfoot?
Yeah, I think you're gonna try to reduce how hard that heel strike is. I think in a lot of cases, it's really hard to not feel that heel touch down first, but you wanna feel as much as your midfoot make contact with the ground as possible, really. You are still gonna feel your heel. It's impossible not to. But yeah, you wanna actually aim for midfoot and then that transition off. Yeah, it is gonna be a little bit further back when you first place your foot on the ground, depending on your flexibility.
Awesome. Thanks, Stacey.
Yeah, thanks for joining in, guys. Hopefully it was useful. My email is on the back of this, so if you guys have any specific questions, give me a little email here, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have. And join Beth next week. She's going to be talking about some of these common running injuries that you can probably get from a funny gait. So that's one thing that you guys can look at. And then I'm going to be back in a couple of weeks, and hopefully that helps to answer some of the questions about what can I do about the strength in my hips and my knees and my ankles to try to give you guys a better push off. So hopefully we can add on that information.